ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all. I'm very excited to see a crowd. We have some more seats back here in the back row too, and there's some more over on that side. I'm Luciana Spracher. I'm the director of the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and we are always pleased to do another Hungry for History program each month. So before we get started with today's program, which is Women's Suffrage Comes to Georgia, I want to announce what our program is for April. And if you want to sign up and you haven't already, you can just scribble on your survey at the end of the lecture and let me know. It's called Beyond the Live Oaks and Spanish Moss, Art in Savannah 1920 to 1960. That's going to be April 1st, which is a Monday. It's going to be right back here at 12 noon, which another lunch and learn where you're welcome to bring your lunch with you. And our speaker is going to be Courtney McNeil, who's Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at Telfair Museums. So today we are celebrating Women's History Month, and Roger Smith, who's the director of the Learning Center at Senior Citizens Inc., and I are reprising a lecture that we gave last year, and I think it was a lot of fun, and we thought it would be good to share it again for this month. And I want to tell you a little bit about Roger, because Roger and I have worked together for quite a few years now, and he's been a really good friend and colleague of mine. We first met at Georgia Historical Society, where he directed the statewide history education program for 6 years. Prior to that, he taught American literature and French language and culture at the high school level, and then became the museum educator at Massey Heritage Center. In 2006, he joined the staff at Senior Citizens Inc. to establish the Learning Center, and that's a humanities education program for people ages 55 and over. And I like to sneak in a lot too because it has really, really great programming. And I'm waiting very eagerly to retire so I can go every day. But in the meantime, we like to steal Roger over so he can do programs for us as well. So Roger's going to go first and talk about suffrage sort of from the big picture down to Georgia, and then I'll step in and kind of bring it more locally down to Savannah.
Luciana, thank you. It's always a pleasure to work with Luciana. She and I do go back a long, I think it's knocking on the door of 20 years now, I'm sorry to say, but it's been a lovely 2 decades, and I look for many, many more in the future. What Luciana didn't tell you is that she's very generous with her time and her talent as well when I ask her to make presentations at the Learning Center. So I'm delighted to be here, but at the very same time, I feel like I'm repaying a significant debt that I have to Luciana for all the contributions that she's made to my program over the years. And in addition to being a pleasure to work with her, it's a real honor to speak in our City Hall. So it's terrific to be here for all kinds of different reasons. Luciana did mention that she and I put this program together just a little over a year ago as a program in which we participated and partnered with the League of Women Voters. And not to be overly self-promotional, but 1 week from tomorrow, the Learning Center is engaging in year 2, the second go-round of a partnership observing Women's History Month, in which we're going to talk about, this will be Wednesday, it's next Wednesday, 12 noon at First Presbyterian Church. We're going to talk about the anti-suffrage movement in Georgia. I'm going to make some references to that today, but next week we'll go much more into depth about what the opposition had to say and what their reasonings were. And I promise the absolute end of Learning Center commercial today is to tell you that there's a stack of brand new spring catalogs here at the end of the table, in which you'll find that lecture and a whole host of other things that'll go on this month all the way through May. So if you're interested in the Learning Center, you can get all the information you want in that way. The very first thing that I need to tell you all is that I don't have a lot of good news for you when it comes to the story of 100 plus years ago, the story of women's suffrage in the United States and the state of Georgia. Its leaders, its activists, its local people. There is far, far, far more bad news than there is good news. All right, so if you came here today looking to be proud of the history of your state at the vanguard of giving women the right to vote, I'm afraid you're going to be bitterly disappointed. There are some heroes in this story, but there are far, far, far more people who did not step into into that role. Before we get so negative, though, I want to make reference to this happier image that's on the screen for you today. It's part of the Vanishing Georgia collection of the Georgia Archives, and it probably was taken in November of 1915 in Atlanta, a parade that echoed the 1913 suffrage parade and demonstration that was organized in Washington, D.C. by the activist Alice Paul the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson. And I should mention that Wilson was not a proponent of women's suffrage in the United States. This is not what this talk is about, but I'll just tell you anecdotally that he had to kind of be wrestled to the ground, right, to finally to give his green light to supporting the women's suffrage amendment. So this parade in Atlanta was headed by a woman named Eleanor Raoul. She led the parade on a white horse. And this photo, if you can, I don't know if you can read the banner or you can't, but what it says is Georgia Young People's Suffrage Association. So there was definitely a youth element. One observer who was quoted in the Atlanta Constitution said, quote, "There were all sorts of suffragists, from the youngest and prettiest debutantes to ladies who have passed their 80th year." So this quotation, if it's accurate, bespeaks a multi-generational effort. You might be interested to know that the very last element person, float, if you want to call it that, was a little boy at the very end of the parade driving a donkey cart. And on the side of the cart, it said, "Georgia catching up." Right? Still had a little bit of way to go before Georgia caught up. So no, this is not the state. This is not the tale of a state or of a region that was at the vanguard of women's right to vote. Georgia and other southern states had far more anti-suffragists than they did suffragists. And you may already know that the official beginning of the women's liberation movement in this country goes back to the year 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, at a women's rights conference. At that time, there were no delegates from Georgia. And when I tell you what the major planks in the platform were for this women's convention, you'll probably understand why Georgia was not represented. First of all, suffrage at this time, antebellum American history, suffrage was inextricably linked with the cause of abolition. So anything that was linked to abolition had no place officially or in terms of public sentiment in the future states of the Confederacy. Women's rights had a strong northern or northeastern association in an escalating time of sectional crisis that would eventually lead to the American Civil War. And it was perceived widely that northern values ran counter to the views of traditional white southern womanhood. And what was it about traditional white Southern womanhood that was problematic and not in keeping with that? Well, here's just a generic image of the cult of white womanhood in the South. This is a Victorian era, and so we are absolutely seeing something that historians call the cult of domesticity. And even though this has sort of an odd ring to it, and it had shackles of its own, this cult of domesticity that had been superimposed on the role of women in the family and women in society. It was actually somewhat preferable to a many centuries long association of the character of women in general with Eve from the creation story, right? The tempter of man, the beguiler of people, right? So women got a really bad rap for millennia, right? Before the 19th century, when in a Victorian, and this has a lot to do with Queen Victoria, right? And her very impressive personality that was superimposed on British society, and her frequent depiction of herself with her beloved husband Albert and their prolific number of children, right? They were often seen in home settings, around a fire, around a Christmas tree, you name it. And so this idea of woman not anymore as the tempter or the downfall of man, but instead the keeper of morals and the keeper of goodwill with children, husband, home, hearth. So the cult of domesticity, where Piety and purity, motherhood, and yes, even obedience were all of these traits that were associated with the right kind of woman. So if politics then was the dirty, rough and tumble, cutthroat world that belonged in the realm of men, then it was certainly no place, the Victorians would say, for the fairer and perhaps the weaker sex. You understand that I'm speaking in the language of the Victorians, right? Just want to make sure. So hand in hand with the cult of domesticity that reached across Europe and the United States as well, add to that a Victorian, that is post-Civil War, idea that was very prevalent in the South, and that is the myth of the lost cause. And without giving a detailed history lesson about what that is, basically it was post-Civil War. The Confederacy had lost the war. Everyone was looking around, casting about for some way to explain this loss to themselves, to the rest of the country, and in some measure to the world as well. And to make it short and sweet, slavery as the major cause of the Civil War was, and I use this term on purpose, whitewashed out of the story, all right? So we get the idea of states' rights being the stand-in reason instead of the perpetuation of slavery as a cause for the Civil War. I'm not trying to say that men in the former Confederate states had no role at all. Indeed, they worked very hard to put back together what had been, prior to the Civil War, a white, generally male power structure, right? An elite status of politics and economics and so forth. But because so many men had been lost, either they lost their lives, or they lost their livelihoods, or they came back maimed and really broken from the war, women had a stronger role than they ever had before. And this is what they set their efforts toward achieving under the category of the myth of the lost cause. They formed ladies' memorial associations, LMAs, to create memorials or monuments. Savannah has one of them, right, from the 1870s, right in Forsyth Park. So they built memorials. They organized themselves by the 1890s into Daughters of the Confederacy types of movements, in which they would try to make sure that the textbooks that would go into Southern schools contained correct history, that is, history that cast the former Confederacy in a positive light. So they had real protests and campaigns against textbooks written in northern states where the picture wasn't so rosy. And of course, underlying all of this was this effort to put white supremacy back into place, even in a post-slavery world when people who had formerly been enslaved were now free people of color. The women's club movement was absolutely tied in together with this, and the idea of women's clubs, places where women could exert leadership and fill those roles, that is a topic that is totally worthy of discussion and scholarship all on its own. Temperance, the idea of ridding the country of its alcohol problem, was absolutely tied up with this as well. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, chapters were all over the place, north and south. So all of these things were wrapped in together. The truth is that suffragists in Georgia had actually much, much more in common with their anti-suffrage opponents than they didn't. So no matter on which side of the question certain women in the South fell on the question of women's right to vote, other than that, and they could be fierce in their opposition with each other on that, they had a lot in common. They were white, they were women of position and privilege, they were women who by and large had enjoyed a fairly high level of education, particularly for their era. They had financial stability, primarily because of fathers or husbands or brothers who earned substantial livings. This, of course, gave them the leisure to turn their attention to the cause of suffrage, whether it was pro or whether it was against, and any kind of social causes. But of course, underlying all of this, because they were white, they also, by and large, believed in a world of white supremacy in the South. Just very briefly, let me tell you what the major planks in their platforms were. If they were on the anti-suffrage side, they worried that women's suffrage equaled suffrage also for, you can probably say the words with me, if women could vote, that meant black women could vote as well. And so in a world where white supremacy and the preservation of it was so important, that was a problem for the anti-suffragists. They believed also that to introduce the idea of women's suffrage would be a weakening of what had become kind of the status quo in the South of black male disfranchisement, right? So even though the 15th Amendment granted men of any color the right to vote, this was dismantled as quickly as possible in the South through all kinds of different measures: poll taxes, literacy tests, literally grandfather clauses. If your grandfather wasn't eligible to vote, well, because he was enslaved, then you aren't allowed to vote either. So every way imaginable to keep black men away from the polls. But the fear on the anti-suffrage side among these women was that if we bring all this attention and women get the right to vote, this is going to cause the federal government to revisit the question of what we're doing with black male suffrage as well as female suffrage. On the pro-suffrage side, the sheer numbers of what would become brand new white female voters, these pro-suffragist people would say, would help white men to maintain those racial and class structures that they worked so hard to maintain. They believed that black women were no more likely to vote than were black men. So they were trying to shut down that or neutralize that as a problem. And they suggested that the 15th Amendment gave the vote to uneducated former slaves and not to elite educated white women. And they saw a real disconnect, a real irony there from their particular point of view. So questions of race also posed problems for the national organizations on the eve of the 1870 15th Amendment. Would women's rights leaders demand the franchise as it was being given to former slaves? So there was a split even in the North over this. Was this, as some people would call, the Negro's time? Right? We're not going to try for everything to include women's suffrage. We're just going to solve one problem at a time. There were two women leaders on one side of this question. Maybe these names are familiar to you. Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone combined forces in a more moderate voice to create the American Woman Suffrage Association. And I don't expect you to remember these names. They're many, many, many syllables, and they're virtually the same as far as their import, but their focuses were different. These two women supported the 15th Amendment, even with its exclusion of women's right to vote. This is back in 1870. So they were the more moderate of the voices on the side of suffrage at their particular time. They said, let's wait our turn. On the more aggressive end of the spectrum, we have these two women whose names are certainly familiar to you. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the older of the two. The slightly younger is Susan B. Anthony. Their organization was the National Woman Suffrage Association, founded the very same year. And I'm going to go back just for 1 second. So American Woman Suffrage Association is the more moderate one, the more aggressive one that was insisting on women's suffrage at the same time as racial equality in the question of the vote, the National Woman Suffrage Association. You don't need to remember these as separate entities for too long, because pretty soon they're going to join forces and they're going to speak more so with one voice. It's interesting that prior to the year 1870, the U.S. Constitution, if you read it, exclusive of the 15th Amendment, it is silent on the question of voting and gender. Let that sink in just for a second. The Constitution did not prohibit a woman's right to vote. And because it was not specified in the Constitution as a decision of the federal government, then by definition it was relegated to the states to decide that. And indeed, before national women's suffrage, there were a few states, mainly in the western part of this country, where women had the right to vote. So in some regard, even though we look at the 15th Amendment as this major step forward, and it was a major step forward, it was one of those immediate post-Civil War amendments that got slavery right, that got the right to vote almost right, and established citizenship and so forth. The 15th Amendment is the first time that male-only suffrage is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. So what it did for black men, it took away from women of all color. So it's good to realize that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said this about the 15th Amendment, quote, "If that one word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out." The truth is it took 50 years, not a century. 50 years still is a long time. And you'll notice that it was beyond the death dates of both of these. So neither of these women saw the passage of the amendment that granted women the right to vote. By 1890, the two splintered groups had reunited into an organization that they called the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. They had annual conventions in Washington, D.C. They engaged in letter writing and editorial writing. They did protests, they staged demonstrations, and they formed state chapters. By 1894, so 4 years after the initial founding of the national organization, there was a chapter in Georgia. So 4 years later. And it was led by a woman whose image is very, very elusive. So we're going to have to be satisfied with just a picture of her gravestone. She was from Columbus, Georgia, and her name was Helen Augusta Howard. She was the youngest of 15 children from a fairly well-to-do family. The problem came in what really brought the right or lack of the right of women to vote in Georgia and in the United States to the forefront of this family is that the father and only breadwinner of the family died. And the taxes that Howard's mother had to undergo, first of all, to settle the estate and then to continue living and raising these 15 children, brought into stark relief for the entire family the fact that this struggling mother was working very, very hard to pay the government the taxes that it said that she owed, but she nor any of her daughters would ever have the right to vote. This was an echo from 1776 and one of the rallying cries of the American Revolution: taxation without representation, right? So we really get that. So for Helen Augusta Howard, she was very instrumental in founding this very first chapter in Georgia of the NAWSA, and began it with only 20 members, the Georgia Woman Suffrage Association. She went to the 1894 annual conference in Washington, D.C., the national conference in Washington, D.C., and she must have lobbied really effectively because in 1894, what she was trying to pull for was for the next year's national conference to be held, not in Washington, D.C., but in Atlanta. And so what she said was, by way of persuasion, quote, "You might hold 1,000 conventions above Mason and Dixon's line, and you will never hear anything about it in the South. The Georgia papers insist that women do not want the ballot. Until you hold a convention in the South and prove them wrong, they will keep on. While a great many people would come to laugh, many would go away with NAWSA tickets in their pockets." So you're going to make a difference, she would say, in paraphrase, by moving this convention, at least for 1 year, to Atlanta. And that is exactly what happened. It took place at De Gives Opera House. This is an image from 1893. The convention was held in 1895. There were wonderful slogans, and I just picked one that's sort of swirled around this national convention. "Taxation without representation is tyranny. Women are taxed. Governments derive power from the governed. Women are governed. Political power inheres in the people. Women are people." It's a little bit difficult to deny any of these statements, right? So they're laying out their case, I think, quite convincingly. And they were not completely absent of male allies and advocates. And I've just picked one, Charles Hubner, and there's a longer quote than the one that I put in front of you. He represented the city of Atlanta. So he's given the official status of greeting the delegates on behalf of the city. And he said, among many other things, quote, "The opposition that springs from a quixotic chivalry is the only one you will have to encounter. Reason and right are with you, and these, in the name of God, will at last prevail." So translation, these white Southern gentlemen are going to oppose you. That comes from a spirit of chivalry. Once you get over that, everyone's going to realize that you've got the right on your side. All right? So he was very optimistic about what would take place. Now, you probably don't need me to tell you that in 1895, the Women's Suffrage Convention in Atlanta was completely and totally segregated, racially segregated, as were so many other aspects of society in the American South at the time. Susan B. Anthony, however, accepted an invitation from this woman, Adela Hunt Logan. She represented Tuskegee Institute and Atlanta University, and she spoke to the African-American suffragist, Susan B. Anthony did at Logan's invitation. So a lot of kind of olive branch swapping took place around this time. First of all, Logan herself joined the National Association, even though it was an all-white organization, and she helped to organize the 1896 National Association of Colored Women. So there was a separate organization for women of color who were in support of women's right to vote. She supported the NAACP in its very earliest years. Hunt did, or Logan did rather, and she wrote for the National Journal, even though it was a white journal, and she wrote for the Crisis, which of course was the journal of record for the NAACP. So an early African American leader. And the last person I want you to learn about today is Mary Latimer McClendon, who is known widely as the mother of suffrage in Georgia. You may know her as if that name Latimer sounds familiar to you, her older sister was Rebecca Latimer Felton, who was famous for being the first woman to serve in the U.S. Senate. This was in 1922, but it was for one day only. Her husband had passed away, and she served for one day. She was a novelty, basically. She was an attraction, and then back went the power to the men. But in 1880, McClendon had established Atlanta's chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she lobbied the state organization to endorse suffrage. They said no. Her very valid argument was that if women had the right to vote, think how much faster we could bring temperance and ultimately prohibition to this country. Look at what good we could do if women had the right to vote. We would certainly bring more muscle to that effort. So once there was a statewide suffrage organization, the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association, McClendon led it. And look at the periods of time during which she led that statewide suffrage organization. The last few years of the 19th century, and then a good chunk of time as well from 1906 to 1921. She lived to see Congress pass the 19th Amendment. Unlike Susan B. Anthony and unlike Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she saw the June 4th, 1919 passage by Congress of the 19th Amendment. Only one vote from a Southern representative, William J. Harris, was in support of the referendum, and he was from Georgia. That we at least had that to be proud of. Georgia, I have to tell you, Georgia rushed to be you realize how these things work. A constitutional amendment is passed by Congress, and then it has a time limitation during which it makes its way around all of the states for ratification by, we hope, enough of them to make the amendment pass. Georgia, during that time of amendment conventions that were going on all over the country, Georgia rushed to be the first state to reject the amendment. Rejection wasn't enough. We needed to be the first state to reject. And that took place on July 24th, 1919. The process, it needed 3/4 of the states to accept or to ratify, so that would have been 36 out of the 48 states. And you may already know which state put the nation over the top. It was a southern state, the 36th state, August the 18th, 1920, which caused ratification of the amendment was Tennessee. Right, so our neighbor just a little bit to the north. McClendon should have been able, this was suffrage winning in the state of Tennessee. McClendon should have been able, after all of her work, she should have been able to vote with all of the other newly enfranchised women of the United States in the 1920 presidential election. But that was the presidential election, by the way, that put the Republican Warren G. Harding into the White House. Just a idle gossip kind of thing. The story is that, I don't know, you can look at photographs and judge for yourself. I don't have a picture of Harding in this talk. The story is that Harding was apparently a very attractive man, physically attractive man, and that perhaps had it not been for women's newfound right to vote, he might not have gotten quite the votes that he needed without the women's vote. But women in Georgia and women in Mississippi were not allowed, despite the passage of the 19th Amendment, they were not allowed to vote in 1920 because Georgia and Mississippi, the only two states, just by way of one more obstacle and one more roadblock, they resisted via avoiding passage in the state legislature of a, quote, enabling act, which would have allowed women during the 6-month period after. It would have allowed them to waive the 6-month voter registration requirement, but they blocked that, and so it kept women in Georgia and Mississippi out of the voting booths until 1921, which is as long as any state could resist. Georgia and Mississippi did that. By the way, just because an amendment becomes part of the U.S. Constitution and becomes the law of the land, that does not necessarily mean that states that have failed to ratify do so immediately. So I thought you would be interested to know some states and some years in which those states finally got around to ratifying the 19th Amendment. Georgia, 1970. Georgia ratified the 19th Amendment in 1970. Louisiana, also in the same year, 1970. North Carolina, 1971, South Carolina, 1973, and Mississippi comes in either first or last, whichever way you want to look at it, and ratified in 1984. So we're going to go back to the image there we go. You see in black there the states that were anti-suffrage. And we're going to go back for at least my part of this talk to our earlier happy image, and I'm going to encourage you not to forget to register and not to forget to vote. So, thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to turn a little bit more locally and focus on Savannah. And on January 18th, 1923, the city of Savannah swore in our first female alderman right here in City Hall, and that was Sarah Berrien Casey Morgan. When we first decided we were going to talk about women's suffrage last year, I immediately decided I wanted to focus on Morgan, as I had been wanting to learn about her for a long time. So my research focused on her life and activities, and then through her lens, what was going on in Savannah in the 19-teens and 1920s related to the women's suffrage movement. So, starting with that, I also want to say that I'm not probably going to mention every woman that made an impact in our local movement, so I want to, apologize for that up front. Sarah Morgan was born in Augusta to, again, a prominent white Georgia family, which I think is typical of what Roger was talking about. She was a charter member of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution and organized the Augusta chapter there in 1892. Then with her husband, Captain Thomas Morgan, Sarah moved to Savannah, where she became very active in social and civic circles. And she was often referred to as a great club woman. And I started listing there at the bottom the clubs. And as I go through, you'll see that list grow of the different clubs and groups she was involved with. So in 1912, Sarah Morgan, along with Eugenia F. Johnston, began to hold classes for women to learn parliamentary law. Morgan was considered one of the best parliamentarians in Georgia, and this led to Morgan organizing the Savannah Federation of Women's Organizations in 1912, and Eugenia served as its first chairman. Through the effort of these two women, the group was chartered in 1913 as the Savannah Federation of Women's Clubs. They joined the Georgia Federation, and then a woman named Kate Anderson Wilson became its first president. In a letter dated 1927, Mrs. Olaf Otto stated the primary purpose of the Federation was to be, quote, a union of strength for public service. In this 1916 quote, the Federation said that the woman could grow to be a unit of power in all necessary reforms and in civic progress. As the 19th Amendment started to make the rounds for ratification, the Savannah Federation endorsed women's suffrage, and Morgan brought forward a resolution at the Georgia Federation's annual convention in Columbus endorsing suffrage. But there was a breakaway group from Macon that felt the federated clubs should be non-political. But the Savannah group here offered a reply unanimously endorsing the principles of equal suffrage. Before I move from this slide, I wanted to just point out there's a list of some women here who came from the ranks of the Savannah Federation, and they went on to make some distinguishable inroads in a male-dominated society. Included is Stella Akin. She became the first female municipal judge, and then we also have Mrs. Purvis, Georgia, the first female foreman of a Georgia grand jury. A couple of the other ones I'll talk about some more. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs was organized in 1896 in Washington, D.C., and then the Georgia Federation of Colored Women's Club was established. Locally, we also had a Savannah chapter that was founded in 1917 under the leadership of this woman here, Mrs. Rebecca Stiles Taylor, who served as its first president. I need to do a lot more research on this, but I wanted to make sure, again, as Roger mentioned, they were segregated groups. So we had a separate federation for colored women. In 1914, Morgan and Eugenia Johnson founded the local Savannah branch of the Equal Suffrage Party, and Mrs. Frank P. McIntyre served as president. This branch dissolved in 1920 to merge with the newly formed Savannah League of Women Voters at a meeting that was held at the Public Library, which I think is our Bull Street branch. The founding of the local league is credited to Miss Mildred Cunningham, and the charter members included Sarah Morgan, Mrs. Pascal Strong, Mrs. Malcolm Bell, Stella Atkin that I mentioned earlier, and then Mrs. Frank McIntyre. And it's interesting to me because the documentation, some of them always use their first name, and some of them are still reverting to their husband's name. So that kind of, just from a personal thing, I thought that was interesting that they're not all, standing up for themselves with their own names. The purpose of this new organization, as written into their charter, was to be a nonpartisan league to foster education and citizenship and to support improved legislation. So Roger talked about the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and as the required number of states ratified it and women secured the right to vote, discussion of whether or not the women would be able to vote in the upcoming election started to circulate. But locally, the short-term focus was just more on celebrating the victory of the amendment being passed. So on August 20th, 1920, Mayor Murray Stewart issued a proclamation from City Hall asking that all bells and whistles in the city be sounded at noon on August 21st in recognition of the victory attained by the women. And the plan was in accordance with similar plans all across the country, and it called for the bells to ring and whistles to blow at 12 noon. Following the celebration, our local paper, the Savannah Evening Press, reported that there was a noisy celebration in honor of the new voters, with the whistles of about 40 factories and ships breaking loose for about 5 minutes. Thomas Gamble, who later went on to be mayor, but at that time was the mayor's secretary, said that he met with only one refusal when he called for factories and shipping offices asking them to sound their whistles. This refusal came from a very determined man who said, "No, I won't do it. I'm opposed to women voting." The City Hall also flew the international code letters that signify "We are victorious." So the leaders of the suffrage movement in Chatham County were very quick to start registering to vote and get on the books. Sarah Berry and Casey Morgan was given the honor of being the first. On August 27th, 1920, after some quick organizing the night before, a group of women met on the corner of Bull and York Streets and then walked as a group to the courthouse, the old courthouse on Wright Square, to register. The group was led by the vice chairman of the League of Women Voters, Mrs. Pascal Strong, and included Morgan, Lucy Barrow McIntyre, and Stella Atkin, all who had been very involved in the Equal Suffrage Party and the League of Women Voters. Mr. McClure was the tax collector, and he told them the books were closed and that they could not register. But Mrs. Pasquale schooled him on what the actual law was, and then they were allowed to register. And Mrs. Morgan was the first woman to register in the county. Throughout the day, additional women came in, and by the end of the day, about between 40 and 50 qualified voters had registered, including 4 African American women. After registering, this photograph here was taken on the steps of the courthouse, and Sarah Morgan was at the center. And the photograph identifies her as the first to register and a pioneer suffrage worker of Chatham County. She was identified as the original sponsor in Savannah for women's suffrage, and that was the reason she was being given the honor by the other women of being the first to register to vote. The following day, the League of Women Voters held a ratification luncheon at the Hotel Savannah to celebrate. It was marked with several speakers, both male and female, including Sarah Morgan, who made a motion to honor Susan B. Anthony. Mr. S.N. Harris urged women to use their influence to purify politics and asserted that women possess superior judgment to men in many respects. He said, quote, "There are many men walking Bay Street today, all puffed up, whose wives made them the successes they are. Women have good business judgment," end quote. Mrs. Frank McIntyre pledged the best efforts of women toward helping Savannah and purifying the political situation, perhaps foreshadowing the municipal election that was to come in 1922. At the forefront of registering African American women to vote was Mamie Williams. A native of Savannah, Mamie was educated at the Beach Institute and then Atlanta University. She began her civic service during World War I supporting Liberty Loan drives. But with the passage of the 19th Amendment, she shifted her focus to politics and registering African American women to vote. She is personally credited with bringing out 40,000 Georgia women to vote, waging a voters' campaign in 160 counties, flooding the state with literature and picketing polling places. In 1924, she made national history when she was appointed the first woman from Georgia and the first African American woman in the nation to serve on the National Republican Committee. She then became the first woman in U.S. history accorded the floor at the National Republican Convention, where she spoke in defense of the Georgia delegation, whose seats were being contested by the faction of the party that sought to strip black Republicans of their power. After the 1924 convention, she established the National Republican League of Colored Women's Voters. Mamie is quoted as saying, quote, "To many, politics is a sordid game, but to me it is the means. To many, politics is a sordid game, but to me it means the getting of everything worthwhile out of it for the race." In January 1922, the Georgia League of Women Voters held their annual convention in Savannah. Mrs. Alstetter was president of the Chatham County League, and Mrs. Pasquale Strong was the second vice president of the Georgia League. A highlight of the meeting was their guest speaker, Mrs. Maud Wood Park, the first president of the League for the United States. During this year, the Chatham County League was very active, providing citizenship classes, conducting a voter registration campaign, and assisting women in understanding poll tax laws. So the Savannah Municipal Democratic primary election was held on December 12, 1922. This was the first election the women voters in Savannah got to be really involved in, and they were major players. It was also a very controversial election, both the December primary and then the general election that was January 1923. In the primary, 3 women ran as aldermanic candidates. Sarah Morgan ran for alderman on the ticket of the incumbent Mayor Murray Stewart, and then Mrs. Lucy Barrow and Mrs. Elise Hawkins ran for alderman on the ticket of the challenger, James Rogers. Haven't really delved into the issues between Rogers and Stewart, but it was a nasty campaign. There was a lot of allegations of corruption and mismanagement by Rogers against Stewart's administration. Morgan was a staunch defender of Stewart. She organized the Women's Stewart Club. And in her own campaign as alderman, Morgan replied to a League of Women Voters questionnaire and addressed her record of educational, patriotic, and civic work as reasons she should be elected. She stated in the paper that I shall be fair and square in political office. And when discussing the topic of appointment of women as city employees, that she thought women as women should not be denied office. Fitness to perform the duties of an office should alone be the controlling factor in the appointment. The local paper cited her long list of civic and social clubs, including the founding of the State Association for the Education of Georgia Mountaineers, which worked to educate Georgia mountain residents, and her appointment by the governor to the Georgia Commission of Illiteracy. Joining her in the election were fellow suffragettes, McIntyre and Hawkins, both active in the League of Women Voters and the Federation of Women's Clubs. Unfortunately, none of them received enough votes to earn a spot in city council, and out of the 3, Morgan came in last. And you can see the men who won spots as aldermen got at least 5,600 votes, and the female candidates, none of them cleared 5,000 votes. So while the women had a presence on the ballot, they had an even stronger presence at the poll. They didn't miss their opportunity to take part in the election, from campaigning for their chosen candidate, casting their own ballot, to making sure the election was fair. The evening press reported, quote, "The women have been most active at the polls since early morning. If anyone doubted the woman's interest in elections and questioned whether or not she would vote and work at the polls, all such doubt must have vanished today." The League of Women Voters opened a nonpartisan information bureau for women in Olshigs, which was on the corner of Bull Street near Oglethorpe Avenue, and there were women workers for both Rogers and Stewart's factions. Particular interest was shown in Mrs. Georgia Nathans. She was 102 years old, one of Savannah's oldest citizens. And so when she cast her ballot, everybody was paying attention to her, and she voted for Stewart. And she was quoted as saying she thanked God she had lived to be able to vote. The primary election was really close. Mayor Stewart just barely beat out James Rogers by only 9 votes. And the primary was conducted with a new system of precinct voting where they had booths lined up on Oglethorpe Avenue. Many criticized the booths, saying they could not see over the sill and watch their ballot be deposited in the box. There were numerous challenges from the Rogers workers, both men and women, saying that they could not hear the manager calling out the voter's name. They were further frustrated by a Stewart band parading up and down the avenue, making it hard to hear. And Judge Adams, who was counsel for the Rogers faction, produced affidavits alleging wholesale election fraud, primarily through ringers who voted multiple times through the day. Women voters demanded a recount and were told it required a petition of 6,000 signatures required in just 4 days to ensure that a follow-up general election would be held. Otherwise, it just would have been the result of the primary. They were told it couldn't be done, but 4 days later, they filed the necessary petition with the clerk. And that effort was headed by Mrs. Charles Ellis. The woman had gone door to door. African American women were contacted through their schools and churches to assist in getting signatures. They divided the city into 4 districts and accomplished the near impossible task. And the resulting general election was then held in January of 1923, and there was a landslide victory for a write-in candidate who wasn't even in the primary, and that was Judge Paul Seabrook. And he won 6,049 votes to Stewart's just 3,952 votes. So really, the women changed everything that happened. I think further research on this election would be really interesting. There's a lot of discussion about the polling booths were used. We have the petition and some of the supporting records in the city archives. And W.E.B. Du Bois, and I know it's hard to read, but he wrote an article titled From Savannah to the Red Sea, which talks about this very election, but from the African American male perspective, implying that Seabrook's success in the general election was due to the power of the African American male vote, with no mention at all of women, either white or black. In general, Du Bois' article and most of the coverage of the elections was not favorable to Mayor Stewart and the Democratic primary system, which in some ways calls into question Sarah Morgan's continued support of him, though she wasn't the only woman to stay on his side. So January 18th, 1923, that was the last city council meeting for Murray Stewart before he left and Seabrook took over. And at that meeting, Alderman George White resigned. And in an honorary move, City Council appointed Sarah Morgan as alderman to fill White's unexpired term. Very similar to Lattimore Felton being appointed honorary in that honorary move in the national level. So Morgan held the position for just barely 4 days until the new administration took over. Alderman Saucy made the motion to appoint her alderman, and that was seconded by Alderman Cabell, who said it was, quote, a privilege to work with Miss Morgan during the last few weeks in a close association, which has given her opportunity to prove her zeal as a worker and her capacity as a leader, and that he considered that in offering her the nomination, they were not conferring an honor, but were honored in having her serve. Morgan took the oath of office just across the hall in the council chamber in the presence of nearly 200 people, many who were women who worked with her in Stewart's campaign. While Mayor Stewart made Morgan just an honorary councilwoman for just a few days, Mayor Seabrook, who followed him, actually made a much greater impact in hiring the city's first policewoman, and he did that with the help of the Savannah Federation of Women's Clubs. Under the guidance of Federation President Hawkins, a committee scouted and secured our first city female police officer, Kathleen Moore, who was a fellow Federation member. Savannah was the second city in Georgia to appoint a woman to the police force following Atlanta. And Moore was appointed in May of 1923. She received training in Detroit, then served as head of the Women's Division, handling cases which involved women and girls. She was responsible for securing a separate section in the jail for women prisoners, and she served until 1955 when she retired as a sergeant. In the summer of 1925, our next mayor, Robert Hull, established the Women's Advisory Board to the mayor. At the time it was proposed, an editorial questioned if it was some sort of appeasement to the women for not being elected to city council, or had the voters treated women unfairly in the previous elections. Though an unofficial unit of government, the board was modeled after City Council. It was designed to advise the mayor on general public interest matters. Some of Hull's friends and associates advised him against it, but he became convinced he had made no mistake in establishing it. The women's suggestions over the years included a clean city campaign, reducing traffic noise, and youth projects. They were able to pay attention to little details to make the city more attractive, and they supported the administration in talking to women's organizations and getting on the telephones to reach out to voters. So Sarah Morgan died June 28, 1931 in Savannah. She was buried in Augusta the following day, and on the day of her funeral, the flag over the dome of City Hall was flown at half-staff in her honor since she had formerly been an alderman. The local paper announced this sort of matter-of-factly, but the New York Times later, in July, reported that this was the first time the flag had ever been lowered in the city's history in the honor of a woman. So it took 55 years after Sarah Morgan ran in the Democratic primary for the voters of Savannah to elect a female alderman directly to Savannah City Council. In November of 1978, Dr. Harris Lantini was inaugurated as Savannah's first female alderman by the people. She served one term until 1982. Dr. Lantini was a career educator, having received her PhD from the University of Georgia. This seems fitting to me since Sarah Morgan is credited with being the first woman to plead for the admission of women to UGA and to work unceasingly to make it coeducational. I also wanted to recognize the women who followed Morgan and Lantini on City Council, continuing to open up doors to city leadership for women. In 1992, Gwendolyn Goodman became the city's first African-American female alderman. At the same time, Susan Weiner became our first female mayor. And in 2012, Edna Branch Jackson became our first African-American female mayor. And that's kind of where I'm closing, but I hope that sort of kind of brings it down to a little bit more of a local level. And if you have any questions for Roger and I, I'm sure we would be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Julie, you want to tell them about your...
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, my grandmother was a suffragette. She was born in a very tiny town in Nebraska in 1901, a town of about 200 or 300 people, and she became a suffragette as a teenager, so I'm pretty proud of that. And I didn't bring the note along. My aunt had shared a handwritten note of my grandmother's that was basically the suffragette's platform, and it was actually kind of humorous to read, but I should have brought it, sorry.
Something about, like, take your skirts off, pulls your pants up or something.
Right. Yeah, it was pretty hilarious. But anyway, so this was, thank you for the presentation today, and thank you to, it's amazing to think about the long flat history.
Well, thank you very much. There is a survey. I'm sorry, Kathy.
Sorry, I just wanted to put in a plug for the League of Women Voters. Thank you for being a part of our month-long schedule of events. Our website is LWVCGA, and it has this and all of the other events that are happening for Women's History Month in it. And we're just so appreciative of you putting on this excellent program again. And I want your notes because there's some anniversaries we need to be celebrating the centennial of in just a little bit. So thank you again for doing this.
Well, thank you all for coming. I did put some things on the table. There's a City Hall pin, postcard for our current exhibit. If you have a few moments and can fill out the survey and let us know what you think, or if you have suggestions for future programming, we always appreciate that. And if you do want to sign up for the next program, you can scribble that on the note too and let me know, and I'll add your name to our list. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So good to see you too.